So, as Sandy's already said, I've been asked to speak today about the appeal to all Christian people at Lambeth 1920. I'm going to do that in two sessions. Okay, so we're going to spend about 45 minutes now thinking about the context and the contemporary responses to the appeal. You've got an abridged version of the appeal in your pack on the green sheet of paper. I'm going to quote from that. It is quite an abridged version, so I'm also going to quote some bits that you haven't got. Then we're going to have lunch. I hope there'll be some time for questions at the end of this first session. We'll see how we do, how quick I am to get through the history. Then in the second session after lunch, I'll talk a little bit more about the influence, and then I really want you to do some thinking about whether or not, to what extent the appeal can still speak to us now. So that's the plan, and that's two sessions of about an hour. So, as has already been said, the appeal was issued by the 6th Lambeth Conference. The Lambeth Conference, for those who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, is the gathering of Anglican bishops from across the Lambeth, the Anglican Communion from across the world. And the first one met in 1867, then there was one in 1878, 1888, we'll come back to that in a few minutes, 1897, 1908, and so you can see that there was meant to be one in 1918, but the First World War intervened, and therefore the conference actually took place in 1920 to give people time to get troops back, for instance, into their dioceses after the end of the war. There's quite some interesting correspondence in the archives about when it's going to be. And they had time for those conferences in those days. It took place from the 5th of July till the 7th of August. And that's particularly interesting because it means it took place just before the meeting of the preparatory committee for the World Conference on Faith and Order, which would meet in Geneva later in August that year. And indeed, some of the bishops went from Lambeth to the World Council on Faith and Order preparatory meeting. And that meant that the appeal, which we're going to talk about, was taken immediately into those circles, which I think is not unimportant. And there they are, the bishops of the Anglican Communion, gathered in 1920. It's a rather small photo. There were quite a lot of them even then. If you could get up there close, you'd see there's an awful lot of white men there. There are two local native bishops at this stage. Crowther, who was a bishop in Nigeria from 1864, and Azariah, who had become Bishop of Dornakal in India, who was the first Anglican Indian bishop in 1920. So those two are somewhere in that mass of gathered bishops. The reason I make that point is that I think one of the things that's really changed in the Anglican Communion since 1920, over the last 100 years, is the way in which bishops, the background of bishops. If I showed you a photograph of the Lambeth Conference from 2008, you would see a totally different balance of where people had come from. And if you, as I once did, went and looked at the backgrounds of all the bishops who were involved in writing the appeal, you will see that all of them who were involved in writing the appeal had trained for the ministry, had grown up and trained for the ministry either in the British Isles or in America. And it meant that the global Anglican Communion in those days was much more connected by people's ministries. So somebody might go and be, say, archdeacon, might have served a curacy in England, been archdeacon in Australia, and then gone and been bishop in South Africa. So there were personal connections between the bishops in those days. Now, I'm not pleading for a colonial church, but I'm absolutely not pleading for a colonial church. But what this did mean was that people knew each other in ways that, and had worked together in ways that is quite different to the current situation. So, the Lambeth Conference has had a history of having an ecumenical interest, And from the beginning in 1867, they considered relations with other churches. In 1888, that led to the Lambeth Quadrilateral, which you'll find on the back of your sheet, which is the basis on which home reunion, so that is, we need to think back to the language that they were using at that stage. Reunion is what we might call church unity, reaching agreements with churches. We'll see as we go through that reunion could mean different things to different people in this context. But the Lambeth Quadrilateral sets out the principles on which Anglicans will move into union with other churches. The Holy Scriptures, the Old and New Testaments, as containing all things necessary to salvation and as being the rule and ultimate standard of faith. Not much controversy there. The Apostles' Creed as the baptismal symbol being used here as creed, and the Nicene Creed as the sufficient statement of the Christian faith. The two sacraments ordained by Christ himself, baptism and the supper of the Lord, ministered with unfailing use of Christ's words of institution and the elements ordained by him. And those three aspects have proved to be key for most churches coming into relationship with each other. And then finally, the one on which Anglicans get very hung up, and we might want to talk about that, about why that is, but the historic episcopate, importantly, locally adapted in the methods of administration to the varying needs of the nations and peoples called of God into the unity of his church. So the episcopate was identified in 1888 already by Anglicans, and actually previous to that, this Lambeth Quadrilateral is technically the Lambeth-Chicago Quadrilateral, which came out of the American context and really is emphasizing the American Episcopal Church, defining itself over and against other churches in the emerging American context. So, in the appeal to all Christian people in 1920, the bishops are building on a history of ecumenical discussion and thinking about relations to other churches, and also thinking about how their own relationships within the communion should be defined. And they draw on the Lambeth Quadrilateral to think about how, in issuing their appeal. We believe, they say, that the visible unity of the church will be found to involve the wholehearted acceptance of the Holy Scriptures, the creed commonly called Nicene, the Apostles' Creed, the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion, and a ministry acknowledged by every part of the church as possessing not only the inward call of the Spirit, but also the commission of Christ and the authority of the whole body. Now you will notice there that the episcopate is not mentioned. And that is because this appeal originally emerged in the context of the Lambeth Conference from the committee which was considering relationships to non-episcopal churches. And there was considerable pressure at Lambeth, for reasons I'll come to in a minute, to deepen relationships with churches, both episcopal and non-episcopal. So they go on to say, may we not reasonably claim that the episcopate is the one-way means of providing such a ministry? Now, non-episcopal churches might reasonably say, no, you may not reasonably claim that. But the Anglican bishops gathered at Lambeth came to this way of phrasing. So may we not reasonably claim that the episcopate is the one means of providing such a ministry? And I have to say the recent history of the Anglican Communion would indicate that the answer to this question is definitely no, but that's something else we might want to talk about. But there's an important proviso here which I think is absolutely central to understanding the appeal and understanding how ecumenical relationships developed from it. It's not, they say, that we call into question for a moment the spiritual reality of the ministries of those communions which do not possess the episcopate. On the contrary, we thankfully acknowledge that these ministries have been manifestly blessed and owned by the Holy Spirit as effective means of grace. But we submit that considerations alike of history and a pleasant experience justify the claim which we make on behalf of the episcopate. If we remove the top and the tail of that, what you have there is a really important affirmation by Anglicans in 1920 that the ministry of all churches and that all churches have the Spirit, are participating in the sharing of God's grace. And that for 1920 was a really massive step. And it underlies the kind of things that quite often happen these days in ecumenical discussions where churches will acknowledge each other as true churches. And this is following on this model, not only this model here at Lambeth 1920, but on the model which was emerging in the post-First World War context. So the first thing I want to say about the appeal is that it is emerging out of a consideration by the Anglican bishops of their relationships with other churches, which goes back right to the beginning of the constitution of the Lambeth Conference in 1867. It also emerges in the context of the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910, and this is often pointed to as the beginning of the ecumenical movement as we know it today. If you read Brian Stanley's recent book on the history of the church in the 20th century, which is well worth reading, he says this about 4 times. Ecumenical movement goes back to the World Missionary Conference of Edinburgh 1910. Well, it does, but there are other aspects too. And that is a particular articulation. At Edinburgh in 1910, there's an articulation of a particular disquiet about exporting European divisions to the mission field. Now, what Susan has just said about people's failure to understand differences between denominations wouldn't have applied in Scotland, I think, in 1910, but it was certainly being perceived as being a major issue for sharing the gospel in the mission field. Why should European differences on how we understand the gospel shape how people are being preached the gospel out with the European context? And there had already been moves to try to overcome some of these differences. One of the most notorious or famous, depending on your situation, as far as Anglicans were concerned, was the Kikuyu Conference of 1913 in East Africa, which was a conference attended by or organised by the Gospel Missionary Society, the German Lutheran Mission, the Friends Africa Mission, the Seventh-day Adventist Mission, the Church Missionary Society, so one of the Anglican Missionary Societies, the more low church one, the Church of Scotland Mission, the United Methodist Mission, and the African Inland Mission. Now, these kind of conferences were by no means unusual at this period, precisely because missionaries were trying to work together in the field. But this particular conference ended with a service of Holy Communion, which was presided over by the Anglican Bishop Peel of Mombasa, who was assisted by J.E. Hansmere, who was part of the Church of Scotland mission. And all the people who were at the conference received communion. Scandal in the Anglican Church. Norman MacLean, who was a Church of Scotland missionary who was at the conference, described this service as epoch-making. The impulse of this will be felt throughout every mission field in the world. So it was seen as being something really significant. Frank Weston, who was the Bishop of Zanzibar, who was a high church Anglican, protested that non-Anglicans had been allowed by Peel and Willis, who was another of the Anglican bishops present, to receive the sacrament. This tension in 1913 continued to sort of rumble through the First World War, and there was a second attempt in 1919 to have an agreement at Kikuyu about how these mission societies might come together. That is a very important piece of background for understanding the appeal, not least because Frank Weston was one of the authors of the appeal. And the fact that he signed it as a high Anglican who had protested to the Kikuyu against the Kikuyu conference was seen by Anglicans as showing that actually high Anglicans too could start to invest in the ecumenical movement. High Anglicans, I'm afraid, don't have a very good track record on some of these questions. So Kikuyu is another of the key parts of the context, and the mission field is another key parts of the context of the appeal. Another aspect, and the reason that we're really thinking about this today, is the First World War of 1914 to 18. And one of the aspects of that was very close to the understanding of the questions raised by the mission field. Men in the forces, and they were men in the armed forces of all Christian denominations, and men of other faiths and none, found themselves together in the trenches. And chaplains increasingly found themselves working with soldiers of different denominations. Now, there are some exceptions to this, questions about how Catholic chaplains were relating to this and how different faiths were being integrated into this. But certainly there's a sense amongst chaplains of the First World War that they are being expected to minister to people of many different denominations. And I think this sense of needing to reach out across denominational boundaries really underpins the vision that we find articulated in section 4 of the appeal. The vision which rises before us, wrote the bishops, is that of a church genuinely Catholic, loyal to all truth and gathering into its fellowship all who profess and call themselves Christians, within whose visible unity all the treasure of faith and order, bequeathed as a heritage by the past to the present, shall be possessed in common, and made serviceable to the whole body of Christ. Within this unity, Christian communions now separated from one another would retain much that has been distinctive in their methods of worship and service. It's through a rich diversity of life and devotion that the unity of the whole fellowship will be fulfilled. Now, I'm going to come back to that as a model in the session after lunch, but I think what we can see here is the idea of each denomination having gifts which it will bring to the table of the united church. And those gifts can then be shared amongst all people. And I think it's this idea very much emerges from the experience of the missionaries and the experiences of the chaplains in the First World War. But there's something else relating to the First World War, which I think is less apparent to us as we look back to it, look back at it, but was very apparent to people and really puzzling people as they lived through it. The First World War, as we look back at it, and as people experienced it, brought about a disintegration of peace and of European life and culture. And one of the big questions for the churches of that, especially the Protestant churches, was how were churches responsible for that, and how should they respond to it? J.H. Oldham, in a text called The Decisive Hour, Is It Lost? J.H. Oldham, who was very key in the missionary movement and a key figure in the organisation of the Edinburgh Mission Conference in 1910, notes, however, the ambiguity of the experience of war. Now, this is written in 1914, so this is still fairly early on. It's sort of autumn of 1914. But this sense of there's an ambiguity about war persists certainly through 1915 into 1916. The war, says Oldham, has been the means of quickening forms of good as well as of evil. Our people have experienced seldom before in their history the beat and throb of a mighty common purpose. And Oldham, already in 1914, is asking, may Christian people not, after the war, in a new apprehension of the magnitude of the missionary task to which the church is called, not attain a deeper, larger unity? So Oldham sees the war as a disintegration calling for unity, but also, along with other people, which we'll see in a minute, sees the war as having unleashed a sense of unity, which actually the churches need to buy into or kind of make use of. And Streeter, in a reflection, who's a biblical scholar, on this war and the Sermon on the Mount, wanted to argue that Christianity is war, Every follower of Christ, he said, must serve on some crusade. The Sermon on the Mount is not to be read as a set of rules and regulations, but as a battle song, the canticle of the knighthood of the cross. Not in its letter, but its spirit matters. Christianity, he says, is neither a code of law nor a system of ethics. It's a summons to adventure. And it's this sense of adventure which has been something that's struck me recently. It's very much there in the appeal, but it's what I think the appeal is trying to do is to pick up on ideas of adventure and apply that have been applied to the war and apply those same ideas to being the church's unity in peace. A.H. Gray wrote in The Only Alternative to War, how can we do away with war and yet retain the good effects of war on the great? A.H. Gray is a Presbyterian who I think by this point he moves between England, Edinburgh, or England and Scotland. I think at this stage he's in Scotland. It's an essential preliminary to any hopeful work for peace to recognise honestly the moral value that there is in law. Now this is, I think, a very strange or quite a foreign thinking for many of us today, but I think this understanding of the need to fight for peace actually is quite important in understanding what's happening in the appeal. War, he said, has the effect of knitting a whole nation in fresh bonds of fellowship and common purpose. It's a sadder, poorer and more confused world on which the sun shines today, but it's in many respects, he says, a better one, and it would seem that war has made it better. So some of the theologians at this time, not just Anglicans, but who were writing in Britain in the early years of the war, are struggling with this sense that actually unity of purpose has been brought about by serving an aim which actually they're really unhappy about. Gray writes very much also about the negative sides of war, but there's this sense of actually there's something positive here. Christ, he says, sought followers with the soldier spirit in them. The more the thought of the kingdom is examined, he says, the more clearly it will be seen to be the one object, the pursuit of which can unite mankind and which can secure for our life all that is enabling in war as well as all that is holy in peace. So unity and the kingdom of God as a way of uniting people around a cause in the same way that people had been united in a cause around the First World War, I think is part of what's underlying this move towards unity that you find after the First World War. Christ's discipleship, says Gray to complete, is so much more like war that the New Testament is full of military metaphors. It's peace in the sense that it involves no military activity, but it has all the thrills that come with essentially great business and the fullness of life that comes with danger. What is dangerous and where is the adventure? And for Gray too, the true Christian adventure is about pursuing the kingdom and pursuing perhaps church unity. At that point, he says, when you're really focused on pursuing the kingdom, war will drop out of the world's life just as swords are dropped by men who want to paint or make music or write poetry. Then there will be peace in the smaller sense, because the world will be full of the noise and the joy of the warfare of God. This, for Gray, is the great Christian adventure. Now, I've articulated that in quite detail, partly because I was just reading these I came across this explanation of unity as adventure when I was reading for a different paper on looking at how Christian love is being preached in the First World War. And it put the appeal for me in a totally new context. So when we read in the appeal, this means an adventure of goodwill and still more of faith, for nothing less is required than a new discovery of the creative resources of God. To this adventure, we're now convinced that God is calling all the members of his church. I think it's this sense of actually how can we find the unity of purpose that had been there in the nation during the war? How can we find that through seeking unity? And I think this is one of the things that the bishops are trying to articulate in the appeal. So how did people respond to the appeal at the time? As I've said, the ecumenical discussions were not just centred on Anglicans at this period. The proposed World Conference of Faith and Order, its preparatory committees were working in national groups and had produced texts about their vision for the future, some of which some of the work of the English Preparatory Committee has real resonances in terms of the text with the text of the Appeal to All Christian People. And at its preliminary meeting in Geneva in August of 1920, it received the appeal and endorsed it. The appeal then needs to be seen as part of this bigger movement, faith and order, but also the movement of life and work, moving to try to think about how society can be improved and how Christian churches can work together to further what we would now call the mission of God. So the appeal needs to be seen in the context of this larger ecumenical movement. Around about the same time that the appeal is being issued, the first attempts at finding a united church and defining a united church for South India are on the table. George Bell, who's the Archbishop's chaplain, Archbishop of Canterbury's chaplain, puts together a series of documents about Christian unity, which which are sent to the Lambeth Conference in 1920, and those include a first attempt at drafting an agreement to bring about the unity of the churches in South India. That was 1919. The union is actually achieved on the 27th of September 1947. It takes them 30 years to get from the first proposal to the agreement. The Church of South India is very much a church which is on the grounds of the appeal of bringing churches which have distinct ways of ministering into a church where those distinctions will not be lost. And that was very much the model on which the appeal was founded. At the same time, around about the same time as a proposed concordat between the Protestant Episcopal Church of the USA and the Congregational Churches of the USA, which seems just to peter out. I can't find anything more about it except for this text that exists in Bell's collection. There were considerable attempts on the basis of the appeal but also preceding the appeal and on the basis of the appeal for what they called intercommunion between the Church of England and the English Free Churches. The YMCA and the chaplains call for united action on all matters affecting the social and moral welfare of the people, the kind of projects where that Susan was talking about, what kind of diaconal work are we doing as churches, and how can we not do all of that together? And this is the vision of unity that is taken up really by the life and work movement. There were proposals in England for pulpit exchange for special services only. There are proposals for mutual Eucharistic hospitality, of taking the Eucharist together at shared services where people are together or when people are together on retreat. All of these suggestions, but particularly pulpit exchange and mutual Eucharistic hospitality, met with opposition from some circles, particularly amongst High Church Anglicans. And you get things being said such as, it's not possible to admit members of non-episcopal bodies to communion except in the case of a dying person who has expressed a desire for reconciliation with the church. So movements pushing really quite hard for working more closely together, being accompanied by those saying that this is not realistic and this is not possible. The appeal is based on the assumption, however, that these things are possible. And indeed, more than that, it's based on the assumption that God wills fellowship. that by God's act, this fellowship was made in and through Jesus Christ, and its life is in his Spirit. It's God's purpose to manifest this fellowship in an outward, visible, united society, holding one faith, having its own recognised officers, using God-given means of grace, and inspiring all its members to the worldwide service of the kingdom of God. This is what we mean by the Catholic Church. So the vision was very much of saying this is possible, and it is possible to bring all Christians together. These days, when an ecumenical text is published, we don't really expect, I think, people to pay much attention to it. The response to the appeal in 1920 and 1921 was extraordinary. I'm not going to try and summarise all the responses, but just to say that there's a press cuttings book at Lambeth Palace Library, and it includes cuttings from The Spectator, The Times, and a significant correspondence in The Times, the Manchester Guardian, the Yorkshire Herald, the Glasgow Herald, the Daily News, the Daily Telegraph, the Newcastle Daily Mail, the British Weekly, the Times of India, and the Evening News, and that's only the ones that made it into that press cutting book. And the point I want to make here is that the appeal had significant impact, not just within the churches, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, but actually in what we would call the secular press. I can't think of any church document these days which would be reported on that level across the press. And these are serious engagements, and as I say, the Times then has quite a long set of correspondence. There is a book to be written, which may or may not be one of the books that I need to write, on the appeal and its reception. And this I think is one of the really intriguing things about it, is it catches the eyes not just of the churches, which it does, but also of the of people in a much broader sphere. Of course, the church press is also there, the Church Times, the Guardian, which was a high church newspaper, not the Manchester Guardian, which is now our Guardian, the Methodist Times, the Methodist Recorder. And this is a time in England when the primitive Methodists and the Wesleyan Methodists are themselves seeking union, and they are considering whether it speaks into their own understanding of union. And it's also reported in the Catholic Herald, but not at all positively. Protestant unity impossible is the headline. So not all of this coverage is positive, but it is a very broad coverage. Most of which engages very seriously and takes it very seriously. And the Methodists, the Wesleyan Methodists, for instance, produce a very long, detailed document about how they want to respond to it. George Bell, in his reports of the 1930 Lambeth Conference on the results of the appeal, talks about or summarises responses from the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the separated Eastern churches, the Church of Sweden, and the Old Catholics, all of which can be identified as Episcopal churches. And on the basis of the appeal, the Church of Sweden invited Church of England bishops to take part in the consecration of their next bishop, and that happened, and then Church of Sweden bishop took part in the consecration in England. So the appeal did very quickly yield fruit in the relationship between the Church of Sweden and the Church of England. And the Moravians as well, I should have said. There's also, on the basis of the appeal, protracted negotiations between the free churches in England and the Council of Evangelical Free Churches in England and the Church of England, which come very close to achieving unity in about 1926 and 1927 and then fail. There's, as I've already said, a detailed report from the Wesleyan Methodist Church where the Archbishop particularly notes that the Wesleyans and the Primitive Methodist Church are themselves involved in negotiations at this stage, but the Wesleyan Methodist Church was nonetheless willing to engage in the process called for by the appeal as well. And the Methodists were involved in the Free Churches in England discussions. The Baptist Union said this is not possible. It's the only free church in England that simply says this is not something we can do. And the United Methodist Church which shouldn't be listed on the Free Churches in England because this is the American United Methodist Church, also engages in quite a lot of detail, as does the Congregational Union, which is in England. What about Scotland? Since we're looking at the Scottish, Bell summarises by saying the Archbishop of Canterbury sent the appeal to the moderators of the General Assemblies of the Church of Scotland and the United Free Church of Scotland, and with the primus of the Episcopal Church in Scotland and the Bishop of Peterborough, visited and addressed the two General Assemblies on May 31st, 1921. In 1922, both assemblies passed resolutions expressing their readiness, as soon as convenient, to enter an unrestricted conference with representatives of the Church of England and the Scottish Episcopal Church. The two assemblies have, however, this is Bell writing in 1930, been absorbed with their own union problem, actually accomplishing union on October the 2nd, 1929, and therefore no conference has yet been practicable. So, how was it received in the Scottish context? The General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1922 passed a resolution saying that the proposals for reunion contained in the appeal come with or noting that the proposals for reunion contained in the appeal come with the authority of responsible representatives of the various national, regional and provincial churches within the Anglican Communion. And one of the points that people come back to over and over again is that this is a global appeal. This is not just something within the English context or within the British context, but it articulates the voices from across the world. Emanating from such a source, the appeal may be regarded as one of the most important of the many recent expressions of the spirit of reconciliation, for which we have cause to give thanks to God. The Church of Scotland rejoices in the noble vision of a reunited church and embraced in the appeal. And it then goes on to say, and this is why we're working for Presbyterian union within Scotland. The United Free Church said, in the perspective of the present, the separations of the past have come to be judged differently, and clamant necessities of the world at this hour are felt urgently to demand the reconsideration and, if possible, the removal of divisions not plainly based on principle and conscience. Sorry, that should be and conference. Now, I think that is very helpful, because how do you distinguish between divisions and divisions which are based on principle and conscience? The UF went on to say, we've counted a happy thing that tendencies and movements of this kind are an outstanding characteristic of the times in which we live. And we recognise in the present appeal a conspicuous instance of what we reverently believe to be a working of the Spirit of God in the mind and life of his church, full of promise alike for the present and for future days. So it was seen positively by both the assemblies. There were other voices, though. Norman MacLean, who we met earlier as one of the Church of Scotland missionaries who took part in the Kikuyu conference, wrote, "The Lambeth appeal speaks with two voices, and the one negates the other." And in the detailed discussion, he said, well, I warm to the vision, but I really don't like the detail. James Cooper, who was professor of church history at Glasgow at the time, so my predecessor, or I'm his successor, I suppose. I'm not sure what he would have made of having an Anglican successor, but there you go. He said, "Proud am I to think of the two great Scotsmen holding the highest places in the conference," that's the Lambeth conference, "and combining to issue a manifesto so comprehensive and so noble." Now, one of these two Scotsmen is Cosmo Gordon Lang, who went on to become Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was Archbishop of Canterbury. While he was Archbishop of Canterbury, his brother was moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. So the next time that an Archbishop of Canterbury came to visit the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, it was Cosmo Gordon Lang at the invitation of his brother, the moderator. So this is one of the two great Scotsmen. I haven't managed to work out who the other one is. I need to go back through my list of bishops and work out who it was. But Cooper was very taken by it, and well, we'll see in a minute, was ready to go off and get ordained by an Anglican bishop. The thing that Maclean didn't approve of, and we'll come back to this a bit more detail after lunch, he said, if we belong to the one Lord, then we should come together at our Lord's table. But this, the appeal, he says, terms an irregularity. I have always deemed it a privilege to receive the Holy Communion in the parish churches of England when south of the border, which was technically not allowed. But I think this is an indication that what's technically allowed and what people actually do was already not the same in 1920, and that's another question I think we might want to come back to this afternoon. I feel it very keenly that I shall never again be able to have that privilege. I could not come to the Holy Table under the condition of irregularity as now defined. No proposals for church union can possibly come to fruition that are tainted and in spirit so alien as this is to the church Christian ideal. So for Maclean, although he welcomed the vision, the detail of the practice of how it was to be worked out, which we'll discuss in a bit more detail later, was actually exclusive, and that's why he sees it as having two voices, a voice of inclusivity and welcome and invitation, and then some practical things which actually say this is not as inclusive as all that. James Cooper, on the other hand, went with the spirit here. I had some thoughts, he writes to Lang, of offering myself up for ordination on the Lambeth conditions, but I think it better to wait a little and try and get the Assembly's assent to several of us doing so, remaining, of course, also ministers of the Church of Scotland. But this is an indication, I think, that Cooper, who was a high Church of Scotland, it has to be said, very interested in ecumenism himself, who wrote a long report for the Glasgow Herald on the Geneva meeting of the Faith and Order Commission, saw this as enabling a coming together of sort of unity in diversity. The appeal says the times in which they find themselves call us to a new outlook and to new measures. Faith cannot be adequately apprehended, and a battle of the kingdom cannot be worthily fought. And notice that language of battle again, while the body is divided and is thus unable to grow up into the fullness of the life of Christ. The time has come, we believe, for all the separated groups of Christians to agree in forgetting the things that are behind and reaching out towards the goal of a reunited Catholic Church. The removal of the barriers which have arisen between them will only be brought about by a new comradeship of those whose faces are definitely set this way. The language of fighting together, working together, facing in the same direction, very important here to the appeal. So I want to finish really by leaving you with that as a vision. I don't know whether you want to finish now, given that we started and be on time for lunch, or whether we might take a few minutes just to have an initial discussion. Yeah? Let's have a few minutes then. We're going to come back to this question, but just have a few minutes as an initial discussion about thoughts of the appeal. Any questions that you've got? And we can perhaps take questions of some fact before we go for lunch, and then we'll come back after lunch.
Just a question of fact. A question of fact, if I may, and thank you for an absolutely marvellous talk. You quoted the people who said that war, in a sense, could actually have some positives in terms of unity. But I noticed all the quotations you had were from 1914 and 1915.
Yeah.
Did those people change their mind and change what they said as the war progressed?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful question. And as I said, I'm aware that these are all from 1914-15. I can't tell you whether the same people changed their minds, because I haven't read anything by them from later, or haven't found anything dealing with these questions from later. But I think you can definitely say that as the war progressed, from 1915, 1916 onwards, the language of the war as crusade starts to diminish, and there's a much more of a sense of the horrors of war starting to take over, particularly after the Somme. the reason I brought these ones is because actually I was quite intrigued. It's funny how when you're preparing two things together and you suddenly see cross-fertilization. I hadn't read the appeal in the context of that early wartime narrative before, and it just really struck me that this language of adventure and this language of unity and wanting to have a cause very much resonates with the appeal. So there seems to me to be some kind of a bridge there, although I don't want to underestimate the fact that even in 1914 and 15 people are saying there were real problems about the war. This is a horrendous thing to be happening. But there is also this narrative, but it's brought about an improvement in moral character is quite often the language that they're using. It's brought about a unity of purpose. It's brought about people being willing to lay down their lives for their friends in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. So there's a real tension there for them.
My name's David.
David, microphone is coming to you, David.
Sorry?
Microphone is coming.
Thank you. Thank you. My name's David, and I really was thinking of the change of the language, and was it becoming much more pastoral, much more let's be supportive to the whole church or the people involved in the war, and certainly in the later stages when we were learning stories of what was happening in the other countries?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. No, it's okay, because I'm not quite sure how we'd know. This is taking me on to the other paper that I was reading for. The reason I was reading the other text is because I'm giving a paper on preaching the love of God in the context of war. And what is really interesting is seeing how people are engaging with love of neighbour. And what that means about how do you talk about loving your neighbour if you're then going to go out and shoot them? And that being more than a moral dilemma, but being one of the key points for particularly for chaplains to be thinking about. So I don't think I can answer. I wouldn't want to say. I don't think there is any sense of at any point in most Christian writing during the war of ignoring the pastoral aspects, but there is a real question about what one's attitude to the enemy should be. I think there's a great awareness of the sufferings of the Belgians all the way through. I'm not quite sure what the question is trying to get at. I think that's part of my problem.
Marcus from Aberdeen Presbytery. On your note sheet, your green one, under notes on context, third paragraph, you write, Resolution 12 made it possible for those of other confessions and denominations to be invited to preach in Anglican churches, providing that such invitees were working towards an ideal of union such as described in our appeal. They did not approve general schemes of intercommunion or exchange of pulpits. Can you say something about this contradiction?
Can I say I'm going to talk about that after lunch. So as I say, this is really about looking at the vision of the appeal, and then I want to look after lunch at those practical workings out and some of the contradictions that are there. Yeah.
David Coleman, Eco Congregation Scotland. First of all, the statements valuing war come over initially at first hearing as rather repellent, but then I was struck by the striking similarity to George MacLeod's principle of a demanding common task, which builds community, from someone who both was in the war and then end up as quite an aggressive pacifist after it.
Yeah.
So maybe that was...
Yeah, I think that's why I spent quite a lot of time looking at those texts, because I think they're very foreign to us. And it's very easy to situate the appeal in the ecumenical movement, in the missionary movement, but actually, the key point, it seems to me, is it's just in this phase just after the First World War, where they do have an extraordinary sense that the churches have utterly failed by allowing the war to happen. But they also have this sense that, as I said, that this real ambiguity that the war has brought about a common purpose, and how can the churches position themselves, not to exploit the common purpose, but how can the churches position themselves to make clear that the true common purpose should be around building the kingdom of God. And I think that actually has really helped me to understand the appeal in a different way.
Very much. The expression kingdom is used a lot. In this world, how would kingdom be defined? And in the battle of the kingdom, who or what is the enemy of the kingdom?
Yeah. I think this is very characteristic for the post First World War period. There's an enormous discussion which will now then start to take shape in the life and work movement around what it means to build the kingdom, and can people participate in the building of the kingdom at all, or is it God who builds the kingdom? As to who the enemy is, so there are very different views across the ecumenical movement about whether or not the kingdom can be built in this world, whether or not how evolution and the kingdom fit together, and about the extent to which Christian churches and Christian societies can become precursors of the kingdom. As to who the battle is, I think probably the easy answer to that is the devil, in that there is a set. But I think there's also there's a sense of injustice is one of the battles to be fought against. Economic lack of economic equity. Some of the questions around how people are treating each other, and how there's a real sense in these texts, and after the First World War in general, about the sacrifice must not have been in vain, and in order for the sacrifice not to have been in vain, we need to provide people with decent housing. We need to provide people with decent education. So there's a sense in which the kingdom becomes, in some people's minds, very closely associated with a certain definition of social progress. Again, that doesn't tackle the question of where the battle's happening. So I think there are different levels of rhetoric happening here. And at the Life and Work Conference in Stockholm in 1925, which is absolutely focused on the question of building the kingdom, some of those differences really collide with each other.
Thank you, Alistair Hulbert. I'm trying to see a parallelism between the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, and the foundation of the World Council of Churches after the Second World War, where Robert Mackey, of course, was our man in the leadership, coping with the huge displacement of people, a very secular issue, not an ecumenical, in the church's sense, not an ecumenical sense, but also the initiative of Money and Schumann for unity. I read the title of this conference actually in terms of that also. There seems in what you're outlining from this appeal, there doesn't seem to be a rooted secular future for Europe alongside or apart from the churches. And therefore I would think, and why now with Brexit, it is such a tragedy that we are facing, because after the Second World War, there was a real initiative to stop war.
Well, there was, of course, after the First World War as well. The League of Nations was founded very much with the initiative with the intention of stopping war, and became a place where many pacifists were deeply involved. And I think the distinction between the time after the First World War and the time after the Second World War is the focus after the First World War is often on friendship, on building leagues, building community, building relationships. There's a movement for friendship between the churches, which starts before the First World War, and which is actually having a meeting in Germany at the beginning of August in 1914, when the war breaks out, and the non-German participants or non-Axis power participants have to get put on trains, and they're sort of put on closed trains and sent out to France to bring them to, and then they're allowed to travel back to the UK, the British ones are allowed to travel back to Britain. And I think that friendship movement is also another really significant aspect of how the ecumenical movement develops after the First World War. So the appeal, the one of the ways it's going to be taken forward is by trying to get people together to talk to each other. And the League of Nations is very much modelled on that same principle. Now that movement moves. So Life and Work, which has its main big conference in Stockholm in 1925, and Faith and Order, which has its big conference in Lausanne in 1927. They then have second conferences, both in 1937, in the summer of 1937, Life and Work in Oxford, and Faith and Order in Edinburgh. And it is those conferences that agree that the World Council of Churches should be founded. So although the World Council of Churches is not founded until 1948, it emerges from a vision which is an interwar vision, and which very much comes out of the pairing of the conferences in 1937. And then, as you say, it then takes shape in a very different way of conceiving what Europe looks like. Although I think the sense that, and I don't work, I haven't done any work on the post-war period, so I'm skating on thin ice here. But I do know that statistics for church attendance and church membership hold up and indeed increase in the 1950s on the whole. It's 1960s where you start to see a really radical falling away. And so the sense of Europe as a sort of secularized entity, I think doesn't fit very well actually with what's actually happening in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. But the World Council of Churches is obviously not just founded to think about Europe, it's founded to think about the churches across the whole world, and therefore in contexts in which Christians are minorities. And that is the context from the beginning into which the World Council of Churches speaks.